Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Behind Massive Screens, a game development podcast here at Massive Entertainment in Malmö, Sweden. And well, if you're new to the show, what we do here is me and Petter, we entice our co-workers into the studio and talk a little bit about them, their job, and everything in between. And well, we got a banger of an episode today, right?
Yep, we sure do. Today we're going to talk about the esoteric discipline of game design. Ooh. So welcome, Martin, expert game designer here at Massive Entertainment.
Hello. Thank you.
Worked on Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, and that's a little bit what we're going to talk about today
yes.
as well. But I'm going to kick off just the first question that we always ask. So we've had a couple of game designers on the show over the years, but it always feels like the word game design, a lot of people have this romanticized view on it. They don't really know what it is. It sounds really fancy, but they don't really know what game design as a discipline is. Does that make sense? So I'm going to ask you, what does a game designer actually do?
Right. Yes. It's a super interesting question. And part of the reason it's really interesting is there's very many different ways to answer it. I think one way to kind of approach the answer is to say that video games is fundamentally an audio-visual interactive digital medium, right? So you can kind of unpack that and say, okay, the digital part, that's the programmers. And the audiovisual part, that's the sound guys and the graphics guys. And then you have like the interactive part. And that's really where, game design lives. With the gameplay part where the user does something and the game reacts and responds and changes and responds, right? So that's what game designers focus on. What does the player do and what happens when they do that, right?
Sure.
On a very, very high level. And then part of the reason maybe that the question can be so you can get so many different answers is that different teams and different games are very different. If you're like three people in a basement making a low poly RTS, the game design challenge is going to be very different when you're like hundreds and hundreds of people making a big AAA action adventure game. So the degree to which you specialize and the things that you specialize on can differ a lot, and the teams that you work with and how you distribute responsibility can also affect it, right? So it's a wide it can be a lot of things. If you work with interactivity, if you work with gameplay, if you work with the rules and the functions of the interactive gameplay parts of a game, then you're working with game design in some shape or form.
Right.
And we have a bunch of subsets, right? We usually draw a line between level design and game design. In a lot of projects, that's a really fuzzy, blurry line, and people moving between those disciplines is not uncommon. Sometimes we talk about quest design or narrative design or NPC design as kind of different things, and sometimes they are, but sometimes they're not. We can have technical game designers, which kind of, sometimes former designers, sometimes former programmers, who kind of live in the kind of liminal space in between and kind of work with both disciplines. So, but what they all have in common is the kind of work with how does the game work? What are the rules? What's the, functionality of it?
Right.
And what I will always explain if like, a grandparent asks me what I do, I will just say, well, if you have, what chess, right? But, I'm the kind of guy who decides what pieces there are, how many there are, how they move, which does black or white start, does the pawn move 1 or 2 or 3 steps, or is it maybe really confusing depending on when they start? Like, all of those things.
Yeah,
that's
and what the winning conditions are.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. And if you change any one of those parameters, chess would be a very different game, right? So that's kind of the space you exist in. So that's the wide answer, right?
Right.
That what is game design and what is a game designer? When a very, very small company, it's just one guy. That person does all wears all the hats, right? But in a game like in a place like Ubisoft, we tend to be very, very specialized and become really grow our expertise in one specific area.
Yeah.
And I'm definitely one of those people.
Yep. Yeah, there's one thing that comes back often in these kinds of discussion about these wider fields is the generalized designer or programmer versus the more specialized AAA kind of thing. I think we can just say that game development is really complicated. Yeah, no matter if you're a big or a small team.
Yeah, and if you've listened to any of our episodes so far, you're on the same page. It's quite complex.
Yeah, we're going to dive deeper into it. But I think that's an interesting for people who are coming to the industry. Just this generalized versus specialized kind of distinction between often the size of the studio is really interesting.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's also we also go through different stages in the project, right? So if you even at the same company, when you're starting out a new team and you're trying to building a concept, then of course the team is much smaller. And then you're maybe doing a lot of different things and you're working much more broadly with a much larger group of people. And then at the last months, you're maybe sitting on this one narrow area and just trying to get that one thing to be as good as it can be and as bug-free and as stable and as balanced as you want it, right? So there's also like movement over time.
Sure. I think we'll return to that topic though, because that's really interesting as well. The timeline of developing a game.
Yes.
Yeah, but before that, it's time for the second stock question of BMS, and that is about you. We want to hear a little bit more about how did you get into the games industry, and what has been your journey, and how did you end up right here at Massive in your current role?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of ended up entirely by accident. Like I've always liked video games. It's always been enormously fascinating to me, especially once you could kind of mod them and build your own levels and things like that. Started with me for like Doom and Quake and those. So I'm fascinated by spatial level design, but I'm actually really terrible at it. I have very little talent for it, which is very frustrating. But I do appear to have a bit of a talent for game design. So I'd never planned to work on games. I studied a bunch of other things at university, but I could never really find the thing I care about. I studied history of ideas, electrophysics, international relations, gender studies. I just jumped around a bunch, and I just couldn't figure out anything that was both interesting and actually a viable career. So then, I got the offer to work at Massive as just a game tester. Or I got a suggestion rather, and I was like, okay, I'll apply and see if they want me. And that was 2006. Started a games tester. I was the second one to be hired for World in Conflict. It was a very small team, like 50 people at the time, I think. And that was really fun. I was pretty good at that. That was a good change from my studies. 6 months into that, they needed someone to focus on balancing for multiplayer. So then they asked if I wanted to do that and become a junior game designer. And I was like, yeah, sure. That sounds like fun. I'm enjoying this. And that's it. Then I just stayed. And I worked on World in Conflict. I worked on Far Cry 3. I worked on Division, First Division. I've been involved in a bunch of other smaller projects that I can't talk about throughout the time, as everyone has been in the industry for a long time. But then most recently, I worked on Avatar Frontiers Pandora from beginning to end. I think if in that first video where we announced that we're doing a game based on James Cameron's Avatar, then I think I'm in one of those shots somewhere. So I was around already then. Yeah, so that's really my history. I kind of accidentally, I thought of it as a summer job before I decided what to do in my life. And then I just, this worked. It was fun. And I went from junior game designer to game designer to senior to game designer, and I'm an expert game designer. So I've been here for, 18 years, 19 years? I don't know.
Math is hard, but I think 18 years.
That's not the type of game designer I am. I use Excel for that stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's very, very interesting that you got your start in QC or game testing, because a lot of the time when you look online how to get into the games industry, that's, I think, one of the first advice that always pops up. Try to get into QC, try to get into game testing, and work your way up. Because, tell me a little bit about game testing, because for me, it feels like you're kind of in the center where everything is coming together before it's finalized.
Absolutely.
And you see all the tendrils working its way up. So you can kind of spot like what you have an amplitude for.
Absolutely. Like you're sitting in the middle of in many ways, you're the closest person to the game, right? And you're also sitting like in the center of the kind of amphitheater, and you're watching all the people working all around you. So it's a really cool way to understand game development. I think there is, as you say, there is this kind of idea that it's a really good way to get your foot in the door, and that can be true. But I really want to stress that it's not as true maybe as it was, because I'm talking about when I joined Massive in 2006, right? We didn't know what we were doing. There were no university educations for game testers. There are now, and they're very good. So, and there was barely at that time schools for game designers. I remember some of the people hired kind of at around the same time as me. One of them is a director at Massive now. They were coming from a game design school at the time in Sweden.
Right.
So we've had those for a long time. And when we hire for a designer role, typically we're going to be looking at the applicants we look at is going to be of very high quality because people are very skilled now. I don't have that type of university education, so I had to learn a bunch of those things on the job. But I don't think today I would have had that chance to get into the industry that way as easily. So it's not like I would recommend that necessarily as a career path. If you want to be a game designer, then I think go to school and, or make your own games.
Yeah.
If you have done those things and you want to understand like AAA game development from the inside, I think a game testing job, QC job can be really good to do that, but it's not necessarily like a good way to kind of advance.
Yeah.
It still happens sometimes, but it's all about the person and the time and the opportunity. So
yeah, maybe good as a summer job or a job alongside school.
Potentially. I mean, we have it's full-time employment, so
of course.
And I don't want to also just want to make sure I don't want to undermine like game testing as I don't like it when people say that this is like just a recruitment pool for like real devs. It's not the case. Like our game testers are very serious professionals, and we have some people who have been game testers for like decades, and they're great at their jobs, and our games would be much worse without them. It's a real skill to kind of really understand the process and the needs, and it's as hard as everything else, just in a different way.
Yeah, I think we've seen generally now looking online, like the shift has gone from like back in the day, it was definitely the QC that was on the top of those. But now it's more like just you want to make a game, go download Unity or Unreal and just get started.
Yeah, start modding.
Essentially. Yeah. All right, so gonna dive back into the game design part now.
Oh yeah, we're gonna dig deeper now.
Yeah. So what we usually like to talk about at Behind Massive Screens is not only what your discipline means, but before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty details of these things, like we really want to know what the people who come to BMS actually do. And with that, we don't mean just a discipline. It's like, what does a game designer do when they arrive at the office? What is a typical, and this tends to shift definitely during the phases of production, but what do you do when you get to the office? Check emails is usually the first thing people say.
The first thing I will do is get a coffee and try to remember what my name is.
Yeah, that sounds.
And then I'll just probably sit down, look at Teams on my phone and see what's going on. What meetings do I have? Is there anything that's urgently broken that I need to deal with before anything else? If there isn't, okay, sit on my computer, check emails. We work with people from all over the world, so a lot of times you have a clear inbox in the evening, and then you come in to work in the morning, and suddenly there's some crisis that you need to deal with on the other side of the earth, in some code studio. That happens, and then grab the latest data from the servers and load up the game and just what am I doing? It depends. A lot of times we will have like a stand-up meeting in the morning where everyone just kind of checks in. Depends on the specific production methodology of that team or that project. And figure out, what's my tasks, what's my priorities, what's happening this week, what's happening this sprint, what do I need to do today? The kind of work that I do specifically, I work very closely with programmers and animators. So what they are doing this day or this week tends to really impact what I'm doing as well. If someone is working on, climbing, then I will probably kind of keep an eye on that and test that in the game and make sure that all the questions are answered. We have all the resources we need for that work and so on.
Yeah, because I guess with the game designer role, it is deciding on what is done and how it should end up, then divvying that out to the different disciplines that work on it, and then see when it comes together, is this what it should have been? And then direct from there.
Yeah, when we say decide how it should be done, it's important to recognize that there's you always exist in a hierarchy on these projects. Like you have the high level creative visions from the creative director and game director that say, this is a game about, whatever, being a Navi on Pandora, right? Okay, what does that mean? And then you can kind of and so if I'm working on as a game designer, I don't own the game. I will own on Avatar, I owned player movement specifically. Like when you're running around on foot, how does that work? How does that feel?
Sure.
And first thing, we establish the style, the goal, the aesthetics, and we kind of with the directors, with the leads, to make sure everyone is aligned that this is the type of movement we want. And once that's clear, it is my job to really figure out the details and make sure that happens, right? together with the production department and the programming leads and everything like that.
Yeah, I think maybe I'm going to jump into, because of the stuff you bring up now, I'm going to just jump slightly to a question we usually ask later on, but I think it's important with the discussion the two of you are having. Communication with other teams.
Yeah.
Like you talked about animation and programming. Like how does that communication look? How do you sync up with these things? You're saying climbing, okay, the animation on climbing. But I guess that will come back like, okay, but the animation on this climbing doesn't feel like it should, or vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, I worked with what we call in Ubisoft 3Cs, character, camera, controls, for a long time. And in that particular space, it's really important to have a close connection between the different disciplines. So we will usually have a task force or a strike team or whatever you want to call it, some kind of metaphor, but let's say a task force, and the idea is usually to have a group of people who can kind of solve the problem on their own, right? So you have the designers you need, you have the programmers you need, the animators you need, and that will usually cover you for the basic needs. And then you will have dependencies on sound and VFX, but they're in the iteration loop, they're secondary. Mm-hmm. So usually animation, programming, and game design is where the real iteration work happens. So normally it's just, you start with an idea, you start with a concept. I want to be able to climb ladders, let's say, cool. And then you think about what other games have climbing ladders, which of those feel good. And you try to kind of establish, like, where do we want to exist in this space? What functionality will players expect? What do we want to deliver? Okay, so we can climb up and down. Can we shoot a gun while on a ladder? Maybe. Sounds expensive. Maybe not that interesting. We'll see. And then you just kind of start with the basics and you build that, and then you iterate on it. My job as a game designer, part of that is communicating the kind of vision to all the other departments to say, we want our ladder climbing to be very athletic. The character is a parkour expert with a background in, as a special agent. They should be able to kind of just freaking run up that ladder and should be super smooth and agile. Or maybe you can say our character is an injured firefighter and they move with a limp. So when he goes up the ladder, it's really clunky and heavy and painful and annoying, and you should feel the flames licking the heels of your boots as you try to get out in time. Like, depending on what mood you want, what aesthetic you want, you would build a lot of the tuning of it very differently, the animations of it differently, and potentially even the mechanics very differently, right? So for Avatar, Frontiers of Pandora, we tried very hard to make a very smooth player movement, very comfortable, very effortless, right? And that had a lot of constraints for specifically how we implemented a bunch of things. So once the tone is set and the aesthetic is understood, then animators and programmers will usually be the ones who actually do the work. Game designers tend to be, we point and instruct, and we try to be the guardians of the vision as defined by the core direction team, and we try to translate that into specific tasks, specific goals, specific functionality. But a lot of time we're not the ones actually building it, right? So that will be more on the programming and animation team. So my job is largely make sure they know what they're doing, make sure that I can review it, and make sure that I'm happy with what they're doing and they're happy with what they've done, and just get them really excited for what we're doing is an important part of it. At least in my experience, you're a little bit of a cheerleader for the vision of the game. There can be times when the build isn't fun, it's not coming together during early in production where no one really likes what we're playing. And it's my job to be, come on, this will be awesome. Just imagine it like this and keep working towards that vision, right? That's part of the role as a feature owner for something.
Yeah. So many questions writing down with a non-existent pen. Like, okay, we'll get back to these stuff.
Now, you mentioned one of my favorite things to get a clear definition, description of, and your thoughts on it, and that's the 3 Cs.
Sure. Yeah.
So, I mean, in your how would you describe the 3 Cs, and maybe relate it a little bit to Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, what the thoughts were there going in?
I can say coming to Ubisoft, 3 Cs was one of the things, like they would point at someone like, he's a 3C designer. Oh, cool. What does that mean?
Yeah, I think it is a Ubisoft term originally. It's starting to kind of drift out in the industry as a whole through GDC talks and, Ubisoft alumni moving on to other projects. But it originally, like a long time ago, it was core part of a methodology that Ubisoft had for making good controls for good games, and it will start. 3C stands for character, camera, and controls. It's just like, and what the process was: who is the character, and precisely what can they do? What kind of camera do you need to be able to see that and play that well? and what are the controls that will allow that to happen, right? So, but it just means basically, it is that complex because you can usually not separate the character from the controls. That doesn't really make sense. Right. You can't separate the camera from the controls or the character, or it gets very strange, right? So it is complex. We try to have, usually the team works on the camera, works with also on the character or very closely to those people. So we need to have the interaction. I'm sorry, what was the other question?
No,
about
yeah,
Pandora specifically?
And I think there's like also how the 3Cs then influence also level design, because if you have a third-person camera, you need to maybe raise the door so the camera doesn't clip.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I've been working on 3Cs for a long time. I guess I started already on the World in Conflict, but maybe mostly got into it and in Far Cry 3 back in the day, and then on Division 1, I was responsible for a bunch of player movement and cover and cover traversal and stuff like that. The thing is always that when you define how the character moves, you're also kind of defining how it feels to move through the space, right? So I talked about game design and level design being this kind of fuzzy area. Usually not that fuzzy. Usually it's like level designers build the world and game designers make the rules for how the player moves through the world. But they are so interlinked, right? So if you have Super Mario movement in Pandora, it's going to be very strange, and vice versa, right? So you have to really understand what is the mood that you want to achieve for the player, what's the experience you want, and how do we achieve that through the combination of these two sets. As a 3C designer, I've worked a lot with level designers to try to kind of establish the rules and kind of talk about metrics, just what's the numbers, how high can you jump, how far can you jump. If you make a canyon that's wider than this, then I can't jump it. If it's narrower, I can. And if you make it where it's just like exactly in between, it's not good, because then as a player, I'm not sure if I can reach it or not until I try. And that's not a good experience. So try to make it either clearly too wide or clearly, so it's that type of thing. I've worked a lot with level designers and prop artists and environment artists to try to like make sure we build something that doesn't only look good, but also plays well. That if there's a cliff in Pandora, usually, hopefully, you will see if it's able to be traversed or not. If there's a rock, you will usually be able to tell, oh, I can jump onto that. Or you could say, oh, that's too high for me. So that's the kind of things where I've been involved with that part. Interior metrics is, of course, like a different beast. Like in Division, we did this a lot because it was very few rocks, mostly man-made. And it was an interesting challenge because everyone understands like how wide is a doorway. But maybe with the particular camera we had, we needed doorways to be slightly larger to be comfortable for the camera to fit inside of them. So we had to make our doors in Division is like weirdly large. They're much larger than doors in real life because, otherwise the camera can't really comfortably go through it. And in Avatars, Frontiers, and Pandora, we have spaces where the character is inside. The character, of course, is a Navi. And when they are inside human-sized spaces, like those spaces are against all our metrics. They don't feel good. It's weird to move in them. And that's the point. Yeah, right?
Intentional.
You're supposed to be kind of out of your element, that you're crammed into this little dollhouse and being really awkward. At the same time, you feel really large and big and strong, right? So that was really interesting to kind of see for our game, what metrics are we using for indoor spaces so that they feel right, both from aesthetically and gameplay wise, right? So that's a really interesting specific example of working with 3Cs and metrics.
Yeah, and hit that sweet point where when you're inside a human-built complex, that it feels, claustrophobic and a little bit hard, but not so that you get stuck and you're constantly...
The thing we try to...
doesn't get frustrating.
With the RDA bases that you fight in, that you try to disable them, these large factories and, engineering installations, our goal was try to make them feel and look like a real scary place, but also make them in essence, be a playground for you, where it's really comfortable and nice to move around in, and everything is trying to sized and scaled to be kind of appropriate to you, to be able to kick their ass in this area. And that was a really fun challenge as well that, took a lot of time kind of dialing that in correctly.
I think we're moving towards one question that I've had. Sorry, Dóri, if you have.
No, go for
I
it.
am very rambly.
No.
Subject, so.
It fit in perfectly.
I would. We would never. I can sit here and listen to this all day. Actually, the question that keeps popping up into my mind, and this might become a bit vague. We're talking about the challenge. We're talking about how to make a character feel in a special way, like either free and bouncy, like the Navi are, but also like crammed into these spaces. You talked about the ladders before, which I think was fascinating. Between the different characters, maybe it's a Navi that's bouncing up a ladder. Maybe it's, as you say, a injured firefighter trying to make their way up this ladder. But how? Like that coming back, we can talk about it. Like, we want to make them feel like this, okay? But how?
Yeah,
because you see that
that's
in
where
video
the
games.
magic happens.
Exactly, because you can feel it in video games. Like, how many video games have we had where the main character towards the end is injured, crawling, and suddenly the sluggish movements, you can really feel it. Or the freedom of running around like a Navi. The first time I sat down to play Avatar, it's like, I'm bouncing around and having so much fun just running. But that for me as a player is something, it's instinct. You feel it through the controls. You feel it through, as you say, the 3Cs, for example, the same way you can feel really cool as a division agent sliding over a car and just jumping behind cover. But how?
Yeah. And like trying to answer that question is really just kind of, currently the goal of my career, right? How do you do that well as an expert specifically on 3Cs? I'm fascinated by the subject because I feel like as a 3C game designer, I get to insert myself on the level of the game that is closest to the player. Like when I tune, how does the buttons work? How does the sticks move? And how does the character move in response? I am right next to the player kind of in a way, right? And I really appreciate that, where you get to live on that instinctual level rather than like cerebral one. But anyway, yeah. So how to do it right? I mean, it's incredibly complicated, but I have a colleague who did a really good talk at GDC recently about some play traversal, and he's been thinking a lot about this, trying to formulate it. And stuff that he talks about is says like really good controls they're smooth, they're predictable, they're responsive. So we can talk about it in those terms. But it's a hard question to answer. It's really just, it comes down to a lot of experience. But
because sometimes the end result or the feeling that you're going for isn't smooth and responsive.
No, exactly. That's the thing.
So.
So it's really about understanding where you place yourselves on that. Like, what level of friction do you want? Like, every game should have some friction, and it's one of those things that inexperienced game designers can often fail. They say like, okay, but this area here, this thing, it adds friction. It's not nice. Can we just remove it? Well, you can, but then you remove the whole aesthetic of it. Like a long animation that takes a while to complete, and you're like, oh my god, come on, finish. Right, that's what makes some things very exciting, because you are waiting for it to finish, right? So it is a bit of black magic, but just for character movement, it's really stuff like obviously like a lot of it comes down to numbers. How fast can you move? How quickly do you reach that speed? And what is the kind of acceleration curve once you start? Is it the linear acceleration or is it a non-linear acceleration? Pro tip to junior game designers: you should almost never have a linear acceleration. It almost always is better with a non-linear one. It's weird, but it's true. The more kind of derivatives of position you drill down into, the more kind of the nicer it feels. And I don't know how I can tell, but I can tell, right? There's, if you're playing with a gamepad, like how do you kind of map the stick input to outputs? There's a lot of really non-obvious things. Like, for example, we slightly bias the input towards the primary axis. So if you give it like a straight up input, but slightly to the side, well, the player is probably trying to go straight forward. So we nudge it a little bit towards that direction, not with a dead zone, but just with a remapping curve. So there's like all these kind of little weird things like this. Like if in a video game, you typically rotate horizontally much more than vertically. So those have different sensitivity. They probably have different acceleration curves for the rotation speed of the camera. And if you start rotating horizontally and then you switch to rotating vertically, you want to keep some of the velocity you had, but not all of it. And depending on how rapidly you turn, it gets very, very nerdy and very, very detailed. And when we start getting into things like aim assists, it gets even worse, because then you have a bunch of different factors trying to interact with, like, how does the camera orient and stuff like that. But like, if you want to make it nice and comfortable, usually what you want is rapid response to inputs. You want to have smoothness. and you want to have predictability, right? That will usually just feel nice and simple and expected. And then the trick is to introduce friction to all of this and say, when is it not smooth? When is it not responsive? And, that's where you get interesting things. Like an interesting example from Avatar is that the way jumping works in Avatar is very different. Most games, you just press the button, the character jumps immediately. What we did in Avatar is, because we were struggling with how to communicate the thing, that idea that you're this really large creature. You're heavy. You weigh like 200 kilograms and you can jump like 7 meters high or whatever. Like that, how do we make that feel correct? So what we ended up doing is this thing where most games you press the button and your character jumps. In our game, you press the button and the character just kind of hunkers down and prepares. And when you release, the character jumps. And this adds friction in like the way we want it, where it is a little slower to jump, because instead of just press jump, you get press release jump. So it's a little slower, but it feels correct for the character that you are. It also allows us to do this really neat thing where the longer you hold the button, the more you kind of prepare and charge for it, the longer you jump. And because we have a very large jump distance and jump height, it would have been awkward to control if we didn't have that nuance and that variability.
It just, when you're talking about it, it makes sense to me, because, well, holding in the button, it feels like the character is amping up, and the longer you hold it, the more they're like putting all their effort into the jump.
And it allows us to also give instant feedback and a response to the player. That, because the problem is, if you add a delay, it doesn't feel good, because you get like a latency. I press the button, there's a delay, nothing happens, and then the thing happens. That doesn't feel good. But we press the button and the character, we play a voice line, we animate the crosshair, I think, and the camera dips, and you really understand that immediately the character reacts. The action doesn't happen immediately, but the reaction happens immediately. So it feels responsive, but you still have that kind of little preparation moment that you need to prepare for and anticipate, and you need to kind of ever slightly plan your movement. You can't just wait until you're right at the edge and then jump and get optimal results. So that makes the simple, trivial baseline experience of running and jumping through a forest just that bit more interesting. And there's a bunch of things we did with running as well to try to make it a little bit more complicated, I guess, is the just a little bit more immersive ultimately.
Yeah. But how do you reach these? Now I cut you off. I'm rude today.
You were louder and faster. You must have a better question.
That's the dynamic between me and Dóri. No, but what I'm still on the how kind of deal, because yes, we're talking a lot of theory, or we're talking about the practical implications of the theory here. But for that, for example, for the jumping, first time I played it, like, as you say, you get that friction because you're not really used to jumping working that way. But very, very soon, like after 1 or 2 jumps, you kind of start to understand this is how it works. And you start to get the feel of, as you say, the Navi that weighs a certain way. One game that I always found fascinating when it comes to that is the old Space Marine game, where you can feel the weight of your character. I have no idea how it did it, but you can feel it in the controls. And the same thing here, like you feel that amping as you were talking about. And it just becomes natural straight away. But again, how do you, I guess there was a lot of iterations on this. It usually is. And how did you figure out, like at some point, okay, we're bouncing around. I'm just pressing A, I'm bouncing. Something feels off with this. Like how do you get to that point?
Yeah, and that's where like having a task force of a multidisciplinary task force is the kind of secret sauce, right? Because then you have a playtest together with the team, and you just sit down with it and you go, you know what, I don't know, I think the jump doesn't feel quite right, and what can we do about it? And you talk to the animator who says, oh, I don't know, maybe like, classic rules of animation, there's not enough preparation or follow through or whatever. Okay, so can we do something with that? Well, no, because the animation triggers here. Okay, can we change the code so that there's actually this initial step before? Okay, we can do that. And how would that work with? So then as a game designer, your role is a lot of times to be the one who knows a little bit about all of these things, understand a bit how the tech works, but you don't know the code. You understand a little bit how the animators are working, but you probably can't animate. So you have to be the bridge between disciplines and the one who is always also like the guardian of the vision. Keep your eye on the prize. What are we trying to achieve? What feeling do we want? What experience do we want to create? And are we doing that? Or how can we move closer to that? But it is in these cross-disciplinary conversations that we usually find these answers that, oh, this is too fast, this is too slow. And also like audio comes into this as well. Like when you first time you do an audio pass and the audio comes into the game feels completely different. It makes such a huge difference. The classic example is like changing the sound file for a gun, and then suddenly people think it's overpowered because it just feels much better. Other types of feedback that I'm very excited about is like camera shakes and haptic feedback. It's really fun with a DualSense for the PlayStation 5 because the quality of the haptics we can do nowadays allows for a lot of fun subtlety. And that's a really fun space to explore. It's like one more area of avenue to kind of give, create feelings, experiences with the player and have that kind of all connect together.
Yeah, it's yet another sense being added to the game. I mean, of course, it's visual and audio, so you're using eyes and ears, but now you're also using touch to deliver information and giving feeling.
Yeah, and tactility was like one of the pillars that we had for our kind of player experience in Avatar Frontiers of Pandora. So, I mean, for us, that was very important. We needed the player to feel like they were on Pandora and really like touching the world and being present there, right? That was something we tried to achieve, and I think we did a pretty good job at it.
Now I'm going to complicate this further, though, because talking about haptics is really interesting because Frontiers of Pandora is a first-person game.
Yes.
And we'll get back to the feeling of Pandora and the first-person camera because that was really interesting in the context of this game. But not everyone they're not playing with haptics. It's a first-person shooter. Some people's gonna play on keyboard and mouse. How do you keep that parity between the experiences, if you even can? Because I only play first-person shooter with controllers because I'm a bad player, even on PC. But you're smiling at me.
Yeah, mouse and keyboard here.
Yeah, exactly. We represent two different sides on this. So my experience in my hands will be completely different. This, of course, goes for many games. How do you keep parity between those two experiences? Or even do you?
I mean, you have to keep it in mind all the time, of course. There's a lot of time during the game development where someone will say, oh, but we can have this really feature, it'll be really cool. And you go, no, that doesn't work with a mouse. Right. Or it doesn't work with, a gamepad. So you have to keep it in mind as the first kind of obvious concept. And you need to make sure that every type of feedback, everything the player needs to react to, it needs to be more than one sense, usually, right? This is also an accessibility topic, which we could get into for hours, but like we can never have something that's just vibration because someone might have turned it off. We can never have something that's just audio because someone might not see well, or it can never be just audio because maybe someone is deaf or they have to turn the sound off because their kid is sleeping or whatever, right? So there's like having multiple layers and types of feedback is part of the answer. But then, of course, there are cases where we just build things slightly differently for the different platforms, where we can say, okay, the way you do this with gamepad and mouse and keyboard is just going to be so different that we have to slightly build different systems for it. And we hate to do that, of course, because it takes more time. But we also love to do it because we can get much better quality and allows us to do unique things. When we know that we're making that split, we can usually optimize a lot in both areas. So like one kind of maybe boring example is like a lot of games will have this kind of weapon menus that's like a radial menu which is designed to be really fast and precise with sticks, right? And they are also usually fast with mouse and keyboard, but they can feel a bit weird. So if you can make very different methods, that can be a way to make it more optimized. Sometimes you don't really have to get into it. You can just have shortcuts and both available. On Avatar Frontiers Pandora, we did the same on both platforms. But on PC, of course, you can just use the number keys as shortcuts. And that will kind of make everyone happy, right? So yeah, multi-platform development is a beast. It's getting easier because the console first-party people are making things simpler and simpler. Haptics is one where there's still a big difference, right? So we'll see if that changes in the future.
Yeah. Now, because we're talking about, again, a huge AAA game in Avatar Frontiers of Pandora. And as a game designer, back in the day when I thought of a game designer, I thought of, well, there's one and he controls everything. But it is...
Back in the day, there was just one.
Yeah, but with a big project like this, like you said, there's ownership over stuff. You had ownership over player movement. And of course, the game is in first person. Until you get an ikran. Then it's
Yeah.
in third person.
Yes.
So was that also under you? Was that another team? And if it was another team, how did you kind of synergize that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I did not own the Banshee, the ikran, the flying experience. That was done by some colleagues in Germany mostly, and they did a great job with it. I interfaced with them a lot. We talked a lot, and there's a bunch of things we share, obviously. So it's not like we are completely different silos doing completely different things. But first of all, yes, this kind of thing can be a challenge. And this is part of what the job of being a game designer is, to achieve consensus and make sure that when you have two different groups that they actually line up and the two parts intersect. I talked about game design and level design before, and finding like harmony there, and between different areas of game design, different teams, you always have the same thing. There's this thing I always repeat to my colleagues, like, where you choose to draw lines in your organization is where you choose to have a problem, right? And designing a team so that the problems fall in easy areas is like that's a skill. Like if we had different teams doing player movement and like firing a gun, that would have been very complicated. But when we have different teams doing flying and running, that's not as complicated because they are rather separated. And there is this movement where you switch from one to the other. Even so, of course, we had, there were challenges, and sometimes we had disagreements like, well, this button does this thing on the ground. Shouldn't it do this thing in the air? No, but that doesn't feel logical. So, okay, so So there's always these things that we have to figure out, and it's this thing everywhere.
Yeah, I guess like the matter of finding synergy so that the player experience is similar throughout, even though it is kind of the world of two separate 3Cs meeting.
Yeah, and it's important to, exactly, and it's important as well to, I think, to mention that part of being a good game designer is having the humility to recognize that ultimately this is not your game. I may feel a strong sense of ownership. I'm the guardian for this, and I'm pushing my personal vision for how this should be. But that vision should only be just kind of, I get that from the lead game designer, who gets it from the game director, gets it from the creative director. There needs to be a kind of chain of command, and I need to internalize what the guys above me think and make sure that that's what I'm putting into my work. And if you get a disconnect there, you don't get a solid product.
Yeah, and I guess
sometimes you have to realize that what I wanted isn't right for the game, and I need to change my mind and change my opinion.
Yeah, exactly.
A game designer who can change their mind is the most, or a game designer who cannot change their mind cannot work in a team. That's one of the, some people think like a really strong creative person should like be, no, this is what I want and I won't compromise. If you're like that, you can't work in large teams. Maybe if you're at the very top, but maybe not even then. So.
Yeah, because I mean, you have to be open to that. The people above have a bigger overview of how all of these different things are coming together. And if they're telling you that doesn't work, it's because of how it's coming together with something else elsewhere in the game.
But it's not just from above; it could also be the people below. Like if the game testers come to me and say, you know what? We played this all day and none of us likes it. I'm sorry. I know you like it, but this is just not working out. Or your fellow game designers can say, hey, all of our features that we're working on, they are really hard to get right because you may put shoot a gun on D-pad up, and that's really weird. And like, so it's like, okay, then maybe my idea isn't good and I have to change. Or, or we also do, of course, user testing, consumer testing, where we begin, taking in strangers and have them sit down and play early versions of the game. And if they don't like it, then it's not good. I don't care if I like it. Ultimately, that doesn't matter. Like, of course, it matters for me, but like, it doesn't necessarily matter for the product.
Right.
It needs to be something that people enjoy, that makes people's lives better.
Yeah, that must be super important to the life of a game designer in general. I'm primarily thinking about people coming from the outside, suddenly sitting down. You've designed all these systems. You've designed like the way of traversal, and this feels, this is awesome. And then, as you say, they do like this. I'm sorry, this sucks.
Yeah,
this is not good.
It is difficult. Like the first time you get a game designer who's junior and just joined the project, and they come and they watch a playtest, like it destroys people. They're like, "Oh my god, I thought I knew what I was doing. Like this doesn't work. No one likes it. Everyone gets stuck. No one can complete the first mission. No one finds the ladder. Everyone presses the wrong button. Like no one reads the tutorial text." It's like it is difficult, and you just have to get used to that and learn that whatever you think is probably not correct. So
no plan ever survives contact with the enemy.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Yeah.
Not that playtesters are the enemy. It's
No.
just,
I like to say like no plan survives contact with reality.
That's a good one.
I think that
Let's
works a
go for
little bit better in this
that's a good
business.
Yeah, and I guess it's also a big skill in and of itself of getting that feedback and adjusting to that feedback without, because like when I think, if you have a bunch of game testers, they're trying the game and they're like, this doesn't work, it's frustrating, but you want a little bit of frustration, because if it's just smooth, then you might as well, I don't know, in my mind, be watching a movie or something. There needs to be interaction. You need to have that sense of accomplishment that you did something.
I mentioned this before, like well-applied friction. Like there needs to be challenge. Like, I mean, every game designer should know a bit of psychology, and you probably know about like flow state, right? This notion that you get really immersed in an activity when the challenge is calibrated, so it's just right you are near the limits of your skill. So you're constantly having to concentrate and getting kind of lost in the activity, but it's not so hard that you get frustrated, and it's not so easy that you get bored. So like that's one example of that.
So let's go back then to, I think we kind of figure out how this works. Have we? Yeah, I think we have.
I have a much better idea.
I have a much better idea, and so many questions. But I want to just take it back to, we talked about the first person on Pandora that Dóri started to talk about. And you mentioned like the immersiveness of the first person, the hands, like because yes, you're bouncing around on Pandora and it feels great. And you're jumping, you're fighting, you're climbing. But for Avatar, it's always very, very important that you're there. Like Pandora is such a big, obviously it's called Frontiers of Pandora, like the environment itself, like interacting with the environment more than just bouncing around or climbing on it was super important. So how did you work with that? And
yeah, I mean, there's a couple of ways. We identified very early on that the main kind of draw, I think, for an Avatar video game is this idea of going to Pandora, being on Pandora. So what is the most kind of immersive way to experience that? We figured that's first person, right? That's I think even scientifically proven to be more immersive, right? And like that, one of the ways that I think I mentioned this earlier, one thing we specifically wanted to achieve is this having introduced a sense of tactility, having a sense of touch. If you look at the Avatar movies, actually I think all the movies that James Cameron has done, he focuses on touch, like characters reaching out and touching others. It's usually like important scenes in his movies. And I think he's onto something there. And that's something in video games a lot of times we avoid doing because it's very hard. Like in a first person game, the characters render in first person, usually in different render paths than the rest of the world. So they really can't interact. So if you want the character to touch something, either you fake it or you do a bunch of weird technical trickery to make it line up. It's challenging. In the areas I worked on, I guess there's really 2 or 3, there's a bunch of different ways that I was involved with. But like, first of all, in the basic player movement, when you're jumping and climbing, you do this kind of like animations. We spent a lot of time trying to get it so that it kind of looks and feels like you're actually grabbing and pulling yourself up and touching the environments. And that was challenging and interesting. And important to get right. And that's a place where like the haptics also really enhanced the experience. Like I'm very proud of the haptics for the traversal. I feel they add that sense of actual tactile input. Then another area where I was involved is we had this kind of whole initiative, I guess I should call it, like that we call Touch the World, which we did a bunch of different kind of features and ways that kind of enhanced the sense of the character and was really reaching out and touching the worlds. We had the Helicradion, the orange spiral flowers, right? Where if you touch them, they retract. We've seen them in the movies. So obviously we need to have that in the video game. And so we did this thing with really complicated thing, a bunch of trigger volumes and distance checks and whatever. And the character plays an animation, so it kind of pokes it and then goes, boop, boop, and then boop, boop, boop. And I had a lot of fun adding haptics to that. So if you stand in one of those fields, you hear it spatially, like where it goes like in different distances. Anyway, so we did a bunch of other things like that where the character will kind of reach out and brushes aside the vegetation when you run through bushes and things like that, or touch the wall if you run into it. So it was really just adding a bunch of different things that kind of together create that sense of the experience. And then, of course, it's the harvesting, which we really move in closely, and you move and you touch, and that actually you do it. The idea of that is to get this very kind of tactile immediacy. Like I press the right analog trigger, and as I do, I see an analog effect, and that also kind of has an effect on the kind of gameplay I get. So it was very connected on that was the notion, that the precise movement of the player's finger directly affects the visuals, and that affects the quality, and
and I mean, then there's also plants and planimals that help with traversal,
for sure,
that you interact with.
Yeah, and that, I think I mentioned before that we wanted a lot of the game to feel like a playground. You're this super agile Navi, and this is supposed to be, they kept you in a box your whole life, and now you're free, and now you can kind of explore, and you should feel at home, and this should be a place that feels that you fit there. It's made for you. So adding these kind of more advanced traversal options was a great way to have variety for the player and for level designers to use in when building the world. It was also really interesting process of discussing this, of course, with our partners at Lightstorm, and making sure they were happy with what we were doing, that they felt it matched the IP. They are really serious about making sure that everything is like scientifically plausible. So that was a really fun process of trying to understand, well, if you had a plant that the player stepped on it and they would just get catapulted across, like why would it do that? And how would that actually work? And there are plants that do this type of thing, that react to touch very aggressively.
How did it evolve to do that?
Yeah.
And what are the inner workings?
Yeah, exactly. And we dug into some of this, and it's weird, a number of things that you can think, oh, you know what, that could actually make sense. Like that, you do the math on it to go like, well, Earth gravity, it will be difficult. On Pandora, yeah, no, that could kind of work, right? So that was fun. So I worked on a bunch of those. We have a bunch of mushrooms. We have things that throw you. We have the vines that you grab and they pull you up. A lot of those, I mentioned ladders before, like you have to, how should moving on the ladder feel in your game? Well, in our game, we figured, now we shouldn't use ladders. They just freaking get up there some much cooler way, right? Yeah. We don't have them at all.
Right.
If there are ladders in the game, but if you see a ladder, you can just jump and you go past it, right? That's how cool you are. So that's how we solved that particular problem. What else? Like it was really fun to build all of this kind of set of different ways, things that could modify your kind of the way you move and the way you function in the world. And it was also really neat how we could tie it into the pollution system, that if there's a RDA base there and they release a bunch of pollution, they will kind of turn off the functionality of these types of planimals, as they're called in the IP, this plant animal hybrid things. And then when you kind of defeat that base and you kind of restore nature to its former glory, then all of this is available again. And now the world is interactive and it has all these rewards for you and it becomes a beautiful playground again, rather than this kind of depressing construction site.
And here we're starting to blur the lines again between level design and game design and world design. Sure, we have a bouncing mushroom. It's super cool. We have all the, as you said, scientific. We have the feel. But what do we do with it now? Like, we need to place it in cool places. We need to make sure everything flows.
Yes.
And again, we come to this in the section between these things.
Good controls in an empty space is not that fun.
No.
Right? We actually had it as of a weird goal of ours, that we wanted to try to make controls that if you were just running on flat ground, it should still feel good. Mm-hmm. And I think it kind of does, more so than most other games. And then we had it as one of our kind of goals aesthetically for the game, was that we wanted people to be able to go to Pandora and just chill, and just kind of literally take a walk in the forest and just listen to the birds and look at the flowers and just kind of chill and relax, right? Yeah. And not be constantly accosted by enemy gunships or whatever. That was part of a creative ambition, to make it a little bit of a vacation space for those who wanted that type of experience. And that, of course, had implications for how the movement is. Like when you run in our game, you don't sprint in this super mad dash. It's a little bit more like a aggressive jog, like you're doing a 5K or something. You're hurrying, but you could also do it all day. Like you're not wearing yourself out, really.
Right.
So that's just one of those things where we needed to find the correct aesthetic, the right tone to create the experience that we wanted.
Shameless plug here. Go back to a previous BMS episode with Alex Riviere, audio director, to find tips on how to find a nice place to chill and listen to chill music.
Indeed.
Yeah. No timestamps. You'll just have to listen to the episode.
Alex is a superhero.
Yeah, he definitely is. You should listen to that episode either way. What I'm really fascinated by in general, the non-human part of the Navi. We had Tech Art a long time ago was here. We had Tech Art recently, but in a previous episode a long time ago, we had a tech artist and we talked about rigging and stuff for different characters, like creating the skeletons for them. And we started talking about just creating an orc, like because it's humanoid, it's human, kinda, but still you need to find the way it moves, and that's different. And I think that for the Navi, that's super interesting as well. Like how you've talked a lot about it already, but how you manage to capture something that's humanoid, that kind of look human, but isn't, and it's alien, and it moves in a completely different way. I'm really fascinated about how you approach that in general, which you've covered a lot, granted, but I still think like non-humans are even more interesting than non-humans in some of these cases.
You have to, we don't know real alien races, so when we see like alien races in media, it's always like this sense of, or species I should say, it's always like there are caricatures of certain aspects of humanity, right? It's not, you don't usually play as like weird slug crabs, although there are games like that and they're really cool. But like you choose aspects of humans and just emphasize them and make caricatures out of them. For the aesthetics of Navi, obviously that work had been done for us by Lightstorm with the Avatar movie franchise. So our challenge was to kind of transfer, wasn't to come up with how that should look and how that should feel, but how to translate it into a game experience. And of course, part of that is doing it for NPCs in the world and have them look right and feel right. But for the player, it was a really interesting kind of challenge, as the reasons you say, because there's so many conventions from video games, like how does a character move? How does it feel to jump and crouch or do a punch or shoot a gun or whatever? And a lot of those things we have to think about, like how would the Navi really hold the rifle? Yeah. Would they be able to sprint and fire it, or how would that? And so and a lot of those conversations, of course, again, we had with Lightstorm, like what is the aesthetic and how should this look and feel? But yeah, I guess the short answer is it was just a lot of trial and error and a lot of thinking about it, and we had to be very careful when we chose to do something different. Yeah. Like I was talking about the jumping differently, that we choose to make our jump work as a charge jump, and the way we talked about it and thought about it is that across the game, we almost have like a weirdness budget. There's certain things that we can choose to do differently and ask players to get used to. Like, okay, this game plays like these other games, but these things are weird and they're different and you got to get used to them. And we couldn't make everything unique and different. Like that we needed to make sure that people come into it with the gaming experience, they're comfortable and they can pick it up and they understand it, they get it. And then there are certain things where they have to kind of get used to it, right? So we just did that with jumping. A lot of our player movement, we needed to exist in a conventional space. But if you pay attention, there are things that we do that are rather different. You can use weapons while sprinting, for example. Most like human military first-person shooters will not let you do that because it doesn't make sense for a, British Marine to do that.
Yeah, to run and still shoot accurately.
Yeah, but Navi could, it feels sensible. I mean, and they kind of do it in the movies, right? So we'll let you do that. We can also sprint in any direction, which is also another thing that most first-person games don't allow. But if you start sprinting in our game, you can do it in any direction. Most people don't really realize it, but once experienced gamers do, they're like, "Wow, that's really weird. I must have done it all the time, but I hadn't really realized it." So, and it's one of those things. If you put that in a lot of other games, first-person shooters, it would probably feel a bit strange. So but with the Navi, it feels right. And also like with our kind of power slide move, crouch slide, you travel really far and really fast, and you can board it back up to sprinting and so on. And again, that is more freer and smoother than a lot of other games would do, and that we can get away with it because you're a Navi and it feels right nonetheless. And the air boost and the wall jumping and things like that.
I think like going sprinting and then doing the full jump as much as you can directly into a slide and then continue. That's how I was traversing for a long time because it was just so much fun.
People love doing that. We actually, at one point, we had discussions like, it's a little weird that people do this all the time. Should we make that a little worse so people don't do it because it feels weird? And then we did it, and everyone says, "No, it was better before. Put it back." And we're like, "Oh, okay, fine, we'll put it in." Like, we didn't really intend that to be a thing people do, but it feels good. And like, that's one of those cases where you have to let players sometimes. Well, if they like it, right? And what I think maybe doesn't matter as much.
Yeah. I think Warframe is a good example of that. I believe they had a bug that caused people to move much more quickly and were able to do these helicopter things that wasn't really in the design. And then they're like, people like this. This is great. Okay, let's just keep it and build the game around it.
There's so many examples.
Yeah. We did, I think, early on, like a playtest just about traversal. Like they just, here's a controller, there's a screen, go running. And I had a ton of fun. That's all I did. I just jumped around and ran.
Yeah. We were very proud that we got the player movement traversal to that type of state, right? Where just moving and not really doing anything just felt good.
Yeah.
That's what I'm very proud of my work and the work of my team, because I think we actually did a really good job with that.
Yeah. So as a game designer and even expert game designer, for people watching at home or listening that are interested in taking a step into this discipline in general, do you have any tips for them? Like, where should they start? If I sit at home and I'm watching this, I'm like, oh, I think I want to be a game designer after all. This sounds super cool. Where should I go? I
think if you want to be a game designer, I would say, first of all, find a game design school long term. Figure out like, is there anyone nearby? Do they have, do they have a good reputation? Do people from there actually get a job? Like those, that's a very kind of obvious. Especially if you're a young person, like go to school, choose this as your career. I wouldn't recommend it necessarily for everyone. It can be pretty stressful, pretty intense, and you need to be able to handle that. Like it's still a industry that moves fast, and there are jobs in the world that are calmer. But you need to love the creative chaos and constantly sprinting towards next release date. If you love that, then you're gonna do fine. The other part, of course, is making games. Like if you apply here and you have as a game designer and you don't have a portfolio of games where you can say, look, I did this. This is me. This is my voice. This is my work. This is who I am as a designer. Like it's going to be hard for us to evaluate you, even for like an intern position. So, and also, of course, making games teaches you how to make games, right? Sure. Most good game design schools will have you spend a lot of the time actually building prototypes in teams so that you'll actually understand the process. What is it like in practice to make games? Yeah. How does production come in? Where does the direction come in? Where does the programming come in? The last point, I guess, is just play a lot of games. And I don't mean like just spend a lot of time playing games. I mean play a bunch of different games. Like some of the people whose creative, voice I respect the most and admire are people who play every game for like 2 hours and then they play something else. Right. They play it until they figure, this game has taught me everything it can. I understand it now. Now I move on to something else. And indie games is usually like where there's like a great variety of strange experiments and strange genres and new ideas. And the very, very large games, there's always a limit on how brave we can be with, risky innovations. On the small games, you can take very, very large risks. And that's, as a game designer, that's very fertile ground for, learning about what other people are doing. They say that, good artists borrow and great artists steal. It's very true in game design. We haven't, we've done aim assist in more or less the same way for like 15 years, 20 years. Like once you have a good solution, there's no reason to change it. Right. So understanding being literate in a genre, like what is the standard solutions, both from a player perspective and from a dev perspective, is a very important part of being a high performant developer for that type of project.
Yeah, being very clear on what works in order to think, okay, how can I adjust it or tweak it or make it, fresh?
Exactly. And I guess the last part I could say that if you want to be a game developer of any kind, figure out who you are as a person. Are you very organized? Are you very chaotic? Do you really like dealing with other people? Do you really not like to do that? Like there are different roles to different companies, to different kind of specializations that will allow you to fit better or worse into one of those positions. I think one of the great things about a large studio and a large company like Massive and Ubisoft is that there is room for very niche people doing very niche jobs, right? There's a greater and greater focus on neurodiversity, for example, and there's a lot of accommodations can be made. In a very small company, those types of things might be more difficult. So that's one of the advantages of a large company is the specialization and the kind of accommodations that can happen.
Yeah. We're back to the general and the specific again, which is where we kind of started this episode. Did we come full circle?
Yeah, I believe so. I believe awesome. We can wrap that up.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Martin, for coming. This has been freaking great.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah. It was fun to be here.
Thank you.
Awesome.
We're glad.
But yeah, thank you for listening and or watching, everyone. Don't forget to like and subscribe, hit the bell, all that stuff. Rate, review. The more interaction we get, the more of these we make.
Click all the things and write a couple of comments.
Yeah, do it a couple of times. Yeah. That's it for now, and we will see you on the next Behind Massive Screens.
Thank you very much.
Bye.